In the mind of 15-year-old Malik Robinson, he was the judge, jury, and executioner in the halls of his high school, a delusion that led to the brutal murder of a classmate. But as Malik Robinson sat in the courtroom, smirking at the grieving family, prosecutors were armed with a secret weapon that would unravel his performance. The trial would become a battle not over guilt or innocence, but a psychological dissection to expose the unfeeling monster hiding behind a teenager's face. The afternoon light of a Tuesday in October cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of the Northwood community, a quiet suburb where the rustling of autumn leaves was usually the most disruptive sound. Inside the Green family home, however, a different kind of quiet had settled, one that was heavy, unnatural, and suffocating. Grace Green had called her son Christopher's name for the third time, her voice gaining an edge of maternal anxiety that every parent knows intimately. He was always home by 3:30, meticulously punctual and responsible, but the clock on the wall now read past 5, and an unsettling dread began to coil in her stomach. Christopher Green was a boy who found solace in order and kindness, a gentle soul in the often turbulent world of high school. He was not a star athlete or a debate champion, but he was the bedrock of his small circle of friends, known for his patient tutoring in algebra and his encyclopedic knowledge of classic science fiction films. His room was a sanctuary of meticulously organized graphic novels and model spaceships, a testament to a mind that appreciated structure and creativity in equal measure. This innate sense of decency, this quiet adherence to a moral compass, made him a beacon of reliability to his family and a source of quiet comfort to his friends. On that particular day, Christopher had promised his mother he would help her with the grocery shopping, a mundane chore he never complained about. He had a part-time job stocking shelves at the local library, a position he cherished for the peace it offered and the proximity to books he loved. His life was a tapestry of small, good deeds and earnest responsibilities woven with the threads of a bright future he was carefully building for himself. The sudden and unexplained deviation from this routine was therefore not just a minor anomaly, it was a blaring alarm, a tear in the very fabric of their predictable, safe world. The call to the police was made with a trembling hand, Grace's voice cracking as she explained that her 15-year-old son was missing. The dispatcher's calm professionalism was a stark contrast to the storm of fear brewing within her, a fear that was tragically justified. Less than a mile away, in a secluded park nestled between two quiet cul-de-sacs, Christopher Green's life had been brutally extinguished. He had been targeted not for money or revenge in the traditional sense, but because he represented an affront to another teenager's dangerously inflated sense of authority. The perpetrator was his classmate, Malik Robinson, a 15-year-old who had appointed himself the arbiter of social justice in their school. Malik saw Christopher's gentle nature not as a virtue, but as a weakness, a flaw in the rigid, self-serving world order he had constructed in his own mind. In Malik's eyes, Christopher was a nail that needed to be hammered down, a symbol of a vulnerability he despised and sought to eradicate. The act itself was one of shocking brutality, a physical overpowering that was as much about psychological dominance as it was about lethal force. The motivation, as investigators would later piece together, was chillingly simple and profoundly disturbing. Malik believed Christopher had broken an unwritten social code, a minor infraction that no one else had even noticed, but which Malik interpreted as a direct challenge to his self-appointed status. He saw himself not as a bully, but as an enforcer, a judge who had the right to pass sentence on those he deemed unworthy or disruptive. The murder of Christopher Green was, in his twisted psyche, an execution, a necessary act to maintain order and assert his own supreme importance. This delusion of grandeur was not a sudden development, but had been festering for years, nurtured by a quiet resentment and a desperate need for control. While other teenagers were navigating the awkwardness of adolescence, Malik was building a psychological fortress from which he could look down upon his peers. He interpreted every social interaction through a warped lens of power dynamics, seeing slights where there were none and challenges in innocent gestures. Christopher, with his unassuming kindness, became the unwitting target of a rage that had been searching for an outlet, a vessel for a profound and dangerous pathology. The crime scene told a story of a struggle, of a desperate fight for life against an aggressor who showed no mercy. Christopher had been left near the old oak tree at the edge of the park, a place where children often played and families had picnics. The juxtaposition of the serene setting with the violence that had occurred there was grotesque, a stain on the community's sense of safety. The initial responding officers felt a palpable sense of horror, not just at the loss of a young life, but at the sheer senselessness of the act that had taken it. For the Green family, the news was a cataclysm that shattered their world into a million irreparable pieces. The wait had been agonizing, filled with a hope that dwindled with each passing hour, but the confirmation of their deepest fear was an impact from which they would never recover. The image of their kind, gentle son, who spent his evenings building model rockets and his weekends volunteering at the animal shelter, being the victim of such a vicious act, was an incomprehensible horror. Their grief was a physical presence in their home, a heavy shroud that extinguished all light and warmth. The community of Northwood reeled from the news, struggling to understand how such a thing could happen in their midst, between two of their own children. Parents hugged their teenagers a little tighter, suddenly aware of the hidden currents that flowed beneath the surface of adolescent life. The school became a place of whispered rumors and shared grief, with counselors working overtime to help students process the shock and fear. A profound innocence had been stolen from them all, replaced by a terrifying awareness of the darkness that could lurk behind a familiar face in a school hallway. Detectives began their work with a grim determination, starting with the victim's life to understand his death. They interviewed Christopher's friends, teachers, and family, and a consistent portrait emerged, a boy universally described as sweet, harmless, and universally liked. This only deepened the mystery and the tragedy, as it eliminated any obvious motives like jealousy over a relationship or a rivalry gone wrong. The lack of a clear reason pointed toward something more random and therefore more frightening, a motiveless malignity that was difficult for the seasoned investigators to comprehend. The focus soon shifted to Christopher's social circle and his interactions on the day he died. Friends recalled seeing him talking with Malik Robinson after school, an interaction that seemed innocuous at the time but now took on a sinister weight. No one had thought anything of it. They were classmates, not close friends, but their paths crossed daily in the predictable choreography of high school life. It was a single thread, but it was the one investigators knew they had to pull, unaware that it would unravel a story of profound psychological disturbance. As they delved deeper into Malik's world, a picture began to form of a teenager who was deeply isolated, not by his peers, but by his own staggering arrogance. He held others in contempt, viewing their interests and concerns as trivial and beneath him. He had no close friends, only a rotating cast of acquaintances whom he seemed to tolerate rather than enjoy. This social detachment was a critical piece of the puzzle, suggesting a personality that lacked the basic empathy necessary to value another human life. The act against Christopher was the ultimate expression of this pathology, the final, horrific culmination of a worldview that placed Malik Robinson at the center of the universe with absolute power over the lives of others. He did not kill in a fit of passion or rage. He killed as a statement of his own perceived superiority. For Malik, taking Christopher's life was akin to swatting a fly, an impersonal act of pest control designed to cleanse his world of an imperfection. The profound lack of humanity in this motive would become the central, horrifying theme of the entire investigation and the subsequent trial. The quiet suburb of Northwood had become the stage for a tragedy that exposed the terrifying reality that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones who believe they are heroes. The arrest of Malik Robinson did not unfold in a dramatic high-speed chase or a tense standoff. It occurred with a quiet and chilling banality that only amplified its horror. Detectives Joseph Clark and Mark Allen approached the Robinson home on a crisp Thursday morning, 2 days after Christopher Green's body was discovered. They found Malik on his front porch, casually scrolling through his phone as if he didn't have a care in the world, an image of teenage nonchalance that was profoundly incongruous with the gravity of their purpose. There was no flicker of fear in his eyes when the officers identified themselves, no tightening of his jaw, only a look of mild, almost bored curiosity. When informed he was being brought in for questioning regarding the death of his classmate, Malik's reaction was not one of panic or denial, but of a subtle, unnerving amusement. A small, knowing smile played at the corners of his lips, as though he were an actor who had long been anticipating his cue to take the stage. He complied without resistance, his movements languid and confident, carrying himself with an air of untouchable superiority that immediately set Detective Clark on edge. In his 2 decades on the force, Clark had interrogated dozens of killers, but the 15-year-old sitting in the back of his patrol car possessed a cold composure that was unlike anything he had ever encountered. At the station, Malik was placed in a sterile, windowless interrogation room, a beige box designed to encourage confession through sensory deprivation and psychological pressure. Yet the environment seemed to have no effect on him. He looked around with the detached interest of a tourist, taking in the one-way mirror and the small table with a sense of ironic detachment. He refused the offer of a lawyer with a wave of his hand, stating with infuriating calm that he didn't need one. It was a move of pure arrogance, a declaration that he believed he was intellectually superior to the seasoned detectives sitting across from him. The initial questioning was standard procedure, with Detective Clark attempting to build a rapport to find a crack in the boy's emotional armor. He asked about school, about Malik's interests, about his relationship with Christopher Green. Malik's answers were clipped, dismissive, and tinged with contempt. He spoke of Christopher not as a person, but as an object, a minor character in his own grand narrative, and his tone was flat and devoid of any human warmth or regret. The turning point came when Detective Allen laid a single photograph on the table, a picture of Christopher, smiling and vibrant, taken on a family vacation just a few months prior. It was a standard interrogation tactic meant to humanize the victim and provoke an emotional response from the suspect. Malik glanced at the photo for a moment, his expression unreadable, before he let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound so cold and devoid of humor that it seemed to suck the air out of the room. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated contempt. Malik scoffed, pushing the photograph back across the table with the tip of his finger. "You're really wasting all this time and taxpayer money on him?" The statement was delivered with such genuine disdain that both detectives were momentarily stunned into silence. It was not a denial of guilt, but something far more disturbing, a complete dismissal of the victim's worth, an assertion that Christopher's life was so insignificant that his death was not even a crime worth investigating. From that moment on, the interrogation shifted. Malik, seemingly bored with the pretense, began to confess, but it was a confession unlike any other Detective Clark had ever heard. There was no remorse, no fear of consequences, no tearful breakdown. Instead, Malik recounted the murder of Christopher Green with the pride and precision of an artist describing his masterpiece. He boasted about how he had lured Christopher to the park, how he had overpowered him, and he corrected the detectives on minor details of the crime scene that only the killer could know, relishing his superior knowledge. He spoke with a chilling sense of justification, framing the murder as a necessary action. "Someone had to teach him a lesson," Malik stated calmly, leaning back in his chair. He didn't understand the rules. He thought he could just walk around being weak, and there wouldn't be consequences. In Malik's narrative, he was not a murderer, but a disciplinarian, a righteous agent of order. His words painted a terrifying portrait of a mind that had completely divorced itself from the shared morality of the human race. The most unnerving part of his confession was the clear pleasure he took in the telling. His eyes lit up as he described Christopher's final moments, a sadistic sparkle that betrayed the deep enjoyment he had derived from holding another person's life in his hands. He mocked the police for taking 2 full days to connect him to the crime, calling their investigative work amateurish and predictable. He was performing for them, for the one-way mirror, for the posterity he imagined, casting himself as a criminal mastermind who had simply allowed himself to be caught. He seemed to view the entire process, the investigation, his arrest, the interrogation, as a game, one in which he was the star player. He showed no concern for his own future, for the years he would spend in prison, or for the devastation he had wrought upon the Green family. His entire focus was on the present moment, on the power he felt sitting in that room, holding the undivided attention of 2 grown men. He was the center of the universe, and the murder of his classmate had been merely the act that had finally put the spotlight where he felt it belonged. Detective Clark, a man who had seen the worst of humanity, felt a genuine wave of revulsion. This was not a troubled kid who had made a horrible mistake in a moment of anger. This was a predator, a cold-blooded sociopath who happened to inhabit the body of a 15-year-old boy. The casual way Malik described the act of killing, as if he were talking about a video game, was profoundly dehumanizing. He never referred to Christopher by name after that first scoffing dismissal, only as him or the body, further objectifying his victim to strip him of any remaining humanity. The confession was recorded, every arrogant, remorseless word captured for the future trial. Malik detailed his planning, how he had chosen the secluded location, and how he had made sure there were no witnesses. He boasted that he had done everything perfectly and that their ability to catch him was a matter of pure, dumb luck. This narrative of his own brilliance was crucial to his self-image, and he clung to it even as he was admitting to a crime that would seal his fate. When his parents were finally allowed to see him, Malik's demeanor shifted yet again. In their presence, he became sullen and petulant, playing the part of the misunderstood teenager wronged by the system. He offered them a watered-down, self-serving version of events, painting himself as the victim of a misunderstanding. It was another performance, another mask worn to manipulate and control the people around him, but the detectives watching from behind the mirror saw it for what it was, a pathetic and transparent attempt to evade true responsibility. The contrast between the boasting monster in the interrogation room and the sulking child with his parents was stark. It revealed a personality that was not just evil, but fundamentally hollow, a collection of personas with no genuine core. He was a chameleon, adapting his personality to suit his needs, but underneath every mask was the same chilling emptiness. The only real emotion he seemed capable of was a profound and all-consuming contempt for others. As Malik Robinson was formally charged with the murder of Christopher Green, he caught Detective Clark's eye from across the booking room. He shot the veteran detective a small, conspiratorial wink, a final gesture of his staggering arrogance. It was a silent message that said, "This isn't over. The game is just beginning." In that moment, Detective Clark knew that the coming trial would be more than just a legal proceeding. It would be a battle to force a monster to face the reality of his own depravity, a task he suspected might be truly impossible. The confession of Malik Robinson was a prosecutor's dream, a detailed and arrogant admission that seemed to make the case an open and shut matter. However, the lead prosecutor assigned to the case, Victoria Thompson, knew that a confession alone, especially from a juvenile, could be challenged in court. She needed something more, an irrefutable piece of evidence that would not only prove Malik's guilt beyond any doubt, but also demonstrate the profound premeditation and sadistic cruelty behind the act. Her team began a meticulous deep dive into Malik's life, seizing his computer, phone, and other personal belongings, searching for the digital breadcrumbs that could illuminate the dark corners of his mind. What they found was more horrifying than they could have possibly imagined. Buried deep within the file structure of an external hard drive, hidden under layers of encrypted folders and mislabeled files, was Malik's secret sanctum, a digital trophy room dedicated to his own perceived greatness and his contempt for others. It contained journals filled with narcissistic rants, photos he had taken of classmates with cruel captions, and, most damningly, a video folder titled Projects. Inside that folder was a single file, a video that documented the final terrifying minutes of Christopher Green's life. The discovery sent a shockwave through the district attorney's office. It was one thing to hear a killer boast about his crime in the sterile environment of an interrogation room. It was another thing entirely to witness it. The video, seemingly filmed on Malik's own smartphone, was shaky and brutally intimate. It captured the fear in Christopher's eyes, his desperate pleas for mercy, and the cold, detached voice of Malik as he documented the act, providing a chilling narration like a nature documentarian observing his prey. This was not a crime of passion or a fight that had gotten out of hand. This was a performance. Malik had filmed the murder not as a spontaneous act, but as a pre-planned production. The video was his masterpiece, a testament to the power he believed he wielded. The footage revealed that Malik had not just killed Christopher, he had tormented him, lecturing him on his perceived failings, forcing him to listen to a final rambling monologue about strength and weakness. It was a psychological torture that preceded the physical violence, designed to utterly break his victim's spirit before ending his life. The existence of this video transformed the case entirely. It was no longer just about the act of murder, but about the mindset of the killer. The footage was a direct window into his soul, and it revealed a void of empathy so complete it was difficult to comprehend. For Victoria Thompson and her team, watching the video was a harrowing experience, one that solidified their resolve to ensure Malik Robinson would never again be in a position to inflict such horror on another human being. They knew that showing this footage to a jury would be a devastating emotional blow, but it was a necessary one to convey the true nature of the defendant. Beyond the video of the murder itself, the hard drive contained other disturbing projects. There were videos of him torturing small animals, each act meticulously filmed and cataloged. There were audio recordings he had secretly made of teachers and students, which he had edited with mocking commentary. It was a library of cruelty, a collection that demonstrated a clear and terrifying pattern of escalating pathology. The murder of Christopher Green was not an isolated incident, but the gruesome crescendo of a long and practiced history of sadism. This evidence of a hidden life of depravity was a critical twist. It dismantled any potential defense that this was a tragic, one-time mistake made by a troubled teenager. The digital trophy room proved that Malik was, and had been for some time, a developing predator who took immense pleasure in the suffering of others. He was not a child who had lost his way. He was a monster who had been honing his skills in the shadows, waiting for the opportunity to graduate to a human victim. The discovery also provided a deeper understanding of his motive. The journals on the hard drive were filled with writings that mirrored the manifestos of lone wolf killers. He wrote about his disgust for the weakness of modern society, his belief in his own genetic and intellectual superiority, and his self-appointed role as a cleanser of the unworthy. He saw his classmates not as people, but as symbols, caricatures of the traits he despised. Christopher Green, with his gentle demeanor and quiet intelligence, had become the living embodiment of everything Malik had convinced himself he needed to destroy. This trove of digital evidence became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. It provided the context for Malik's arrogant confession, showing that his words were not just empty boasts, but the genuine expressions of a deeply held and dangerous ideology. The video of the murder was the irrefutable proof of the act, while the journals and other recordings were the proof of the intent, the cold and calculated malice that had driven him. The prosecution now had a narrative that was both horrifying and coherent, a story of a young man who had deliberately cultivated his own evil. The legal team had to handle the evidence with extreme care. The video was so graphic and disturbing that its admissibility in court would surely be challenged by the defense. Victoria Thompson began preparing her arguments, ready to fight for the jury's right to see the unvarnished truth of who Malik Robinson was. She argued that the video was not prejudicial. It was essential to understanding the defendant's state of mind, his specific intent to kill, and the element of extreme cruelty, which could be a factor in his sentencing. For the investigators, the contents of the hard drive were both a professional triumph and a personal burden. Detective Clark found himself haunted by the images and sounds from the video, the memory of Christopher's pleas echoing in his mind. He had arrested hundreds of criminals, but the calculated, documentary-style cruelty of Malik Robinson was something new, a modern horror story born of technology and profound sociopathy. It reinforced his belief that they were not dealing with a juvenile offender, but with an old and ancient evil in a young man's body. The revelation of the digital trophy room also had a profound impact on how the school and the community perceived the crime. The initial shock had been focused on the senselessness of the act, but now a more terrifying picture emerged. This was not a random act of violence, it was the work of a predator who had walked among them, hidden in plain sight. Parents began to question how they could have missed the signs, how a student could harbor such darkness without anyone noticing. The school administration was forced to confront uncomfortable questions about their ability to identify and help students with severe psychological problems. The Green family was informed of the discovery of the video, though they were spared the agony of watching it. For them, the knowledge that their son's final moments had been recorded by his killer for his own sick entertainment was a fresh and profound layer of horror. It was a violation that extended beyond death, a final act of desecration that twisted their grief into a new shape of rage and despair. Their fight for justice was no longer just about holding their son's killer accountable, it was about honoring Christopher's memory by exposing the full, unvarnished truth of the monster who had taken his life. The case was now poised to move from a simple murder trial to a deep and disturbing examination of the nature of evil itself. In the months leading up to the trial, the legal machinery ground forward with its deliberate, methodical pace. Malik Robinson was assigned a public defender, a seasoned and weary attorney named Matthew Harris, whose job it was to mount a defense for a client who seemed determined to sabotage his own case. From their very first meeting in the juvenile detention center, Malik treated his lawyer not as an ally or a lifeline, but as an inferior, an inconvenient obstacle in the grand production of his own trial. He greeted Harris's attempts to explain legal strategy with eye rolls, sighs of theatrical boredom, and open contempt. During pre-trial hearings, Malik's behavior escalated from passive-aggressive disrespect to outright defiance. He would slouch in his chair, doodle on the legal pads meant for taking notes, and occasionally let out a soft, mocking laugh during the prosecutor's arguments. His attorney, Matthew Harris, grew increasingly frustrated, his whispered pleas for his client to behave met with a smirk or a dismissive wave. Malik seemed to relish the power he felt in making his own lawyer's job as difficult as possible, viewing the entire legal process as a farce that he was intellectually above. The most shocking moment of these preliminary proceedings came during a routine scheduling conference. As Harris was explaining a complex motion to the judge, Malik, in a moment of pure, unadulterated arrogance, leaned over and whispered a cruel joke about his lawyer's receding hairline, loud enough for the court reporter and the prosecutor's table to hear. Victoria Thompson, the prosecutor, stared at him, momentarily speechless at the sheer audacity and childish cruelty of the defendant. It was a small act, but it spoke volumes about Malik's inability to grasp the gravity of his situation and his compulsive need to belittle everyone around him. Malik's contempt was not reserved for his own counsel. He viewed the entire system with a sneering disdain, from the judge he saw as a pompous old man to the bailiffs he regarded as hired muscle. He believed he was the smartest person in any room he entered, and he was determined to prove it, even if it meant ensuring his own conviction. His defiance became a central challenge for his defense attorney. Harris knew that his only chance of avoiding a life sentence for his client was to present him as a troubled, remorseful child who had made a terrible mistake. But Malik refused to play the part, shattering any illusion of remorse with every smirk and sarcastic comment. This defiance of counsel was a strategic nightmare for Matthew Harris. He tried to explain to Malik that his courtroom demeanor would be a critical factor for the jury, that they needed to see a young man who was sorry for what he had done. Malik's response was a cold, flat stare. "Why would I be sorry?" he asked, his voice devoid of any emotion. "He got what he deserved. My only mistake was not planning the disposal better." The chilling honesty of the statement left Harris at a loss for words, realizing he was not defending a client, but managing a monster. The psychological evaluations ordered by the court came back with a diagnosis that was as clear as it was damning: narcissistic personality disorder with pronounced sociopathic traits. The reports detailed a complete lack of empathy, a grandiose sense of self-importance, and a manipulative personality. Malik had treated the court-appointed psychiatrist with the same contempt he showed his lawyer, attempting to psychoanalyze the doctor and critique his methods. He saw the evaluation not as a tool for understanding his mind, but as a battle of wits he was determined to win. As the trial date approached, Malik's behavior grew even more erratic and self-destructive. He would refuse to meet with his lawyer for days at a time, then demand a meeting at an inconvenient hour. He would agree to a line of defense, only to completely contradict it in a letter to the judge. It was a campaign of chaos, designed to keep everyone off balance and to reinforce his own sense of control over the proceedings. He was the director of this show, and he would not allow anyone else, especially his own lawyer, to steal the spotlight. Matthew Harris was faced with an ethical dilemma. His duty was to provide the best possible defense for his client, but his client was actively working to ensure his own destruction. He filed motions to have Malik declared incompetent to stand trial, arguing that his narcissistic delusions prevented him from assisting in his own defense. The motions were denied. The psychiatric reports concluded that while Malik had a severe personality disorder, he understood the charges against him and the nature of the legal proceedings perfectly. His destructive behavior was not a product of madness, but of pure, unadulterated arrogance. The dynamic between Malik and his lawyer became a grim subplot in the unfolding legal drama. In the courtroom during procedural hearings, the tension was palpable. Harris would stand to address the judge, his shoulders slumped with the weight of his impossible task, while Malik would sit behind him, a smug, knowing smile on his face. He openly mocked his lawyer's efforts, creating a spectacle that did not go unnoticed by the press or the prosecution. Victoria Thompson watched this train wreck of a defense unfold, knowing that the defendant himself was becoming her greatest asset. The situation came to a head just a week before jury selection was set to begin. Harris had prepared a detailed plea bargain proposal from the prosecution, one that would spare Malik a sentence of life without parole in exchange for a guilty plea. He presented it to Malik in the sterile meeting room of the detention center, laying out the overwhelming evidence against him: the confession, the digital trophy room, the video of the murder. He begged his client to take the deal, to show some semblance of rationality and save himself from spending the rest of his natural life in a maximum security prison. Malik listened to the entire proposal without interruption, his face a mask of detached calm. When Harris was finished, Malik picked up the printed offer, held it between his thumb and forefinger as if it were a piece of garbage, and slowly tore it in half. He then tore the halves into quarters, letting the pieces flutter onto the table. He looked his lawyer directly in the eye, his expression one of pure, unadulterated contempt. "I'm not pleading guilty to anything," Malik said, his voice low and steady. "We're going to trial, and I'm going to testify. I'm going to get up on that stand, and I'm going to tell everyone the truth about what happened and why it had to happen." In that moment, Matthew Harris knew the case was lost. His client's pathological narcissism made it impossible for him to admit fault or accept a plea. He needed the stage of a full trial, the audience of a jury, and the opportunity to perform his twisted version of reality. He did not want to avoid a conviction. He wanted to win the argument, to be vindicated in the court of public opinion, even if it meant losing in the court of law. His defiance was not just of his counsel, it was a defiance of reality itself, a final desperate act of a boy who had crowned himself king of a world that existed only in his own mind. The first day of the trial of Malik Robinson was a spectacle of quiet tension and raw emotion. The courtroom was packed, a standing room-only crowd of journalists, community members, and the shattered families of both the victim and the defendant. The air was thick with a collective sense of dread and anticipation, the feeling that they were all about to witness something profoundly disturbing. Grace Green and her family sat in the front row, their faces etched with a grief so deep it seemed to absorb the light around them, while across the aisle, Malik's parents looked on, their expressions a mixture of confusion, shame, and a desperate, misplaced hope. When Malik was led into the courtroom, a murmur went through the gallery. He was dressed not in a juvenile detention jumpsuit, but in a crisp, dark suit provided by his attorney, an attempt to present him as a respectable young man. But the suit was a hollow costume that could not conceal the cold arrogance in his eyes. He walked with a confident swagger, his head held high, and as he took his seat at the defense table, he scanned the crowd with a look of detached amusement, his gaze lingering for a moment on the grieving face of Christopher's mother without a flicker of remorse. The trial began with the opening statements, the dueling narratives that would frame the entire case. The prosecutor, Victoria Thompson, approached the jury box with a somber and deliberate grace. She spoke in a clear, steady voice, her words painting a heartbreaking picture of Christopher Green, not just as a victim, but as a vibrant, kind, and beloved son and friend whose future had been stolen from him. She described the profound loss felt by his family and the community, her voice filled with a quiet, righteous anger that resonated through the silent courtroom. Matthew Harris, the defense attorney, followed with a performance that was hamstrung by the reality of his client. He attempted to portray Malik as a deeply troubled and misunderstood teenager, a boy who had been failed by the system and had acted out of a place of fear and confusion. It was a narrative of diminished responsibility, the only viable path he had left, but it rang hollow, especially to those who could see Malik sitting at the defense table, looking utterly bored by the attempts to paint him as a victim. The true drama of the day, however, began when the prosecution called its first witnesses. The initial testimony came from the police officers who had discovered Christopher's body and the detectives who had led the investigation. They methodically laid out the timeline of the crime and the collection of evidence, their professional, just the facts testimony building a grim and unshakable foundation for the state's case. The jury listened intently, their faces somber as they absorbed the cold, hard details of the murder. But it was during the cross-examination of Detective Joseph Clark that Malik Robinson chose to make his first move. As Victoria Thompson was asking Detective Clark to confirm a specific detail about the location where Christopher's backpack was found, Malik leaned over and whispered something to his lawyer. A moment later, before his lawyer could object, or the prosecutor could finish her sentence, Malik's voice cut through the courtroom, loud, clear, and dripping with condescending arrogance. "She's wrong," Malik announced, speaking directly to the jury. The backpack wasn't behind the oak tree. It was tucked into the hollow at the base of the tree, on the north side. If you're going to tell the story, you should at least get the details right. A collective gasp went through the gallery. The judge's gavel came down with a sharp crack, and he furiously admonished Malik for the outburst. But the damage was done. In a single, spontaneous act of narcissistic pedantry, Malik had revealed a piece of information that only the killer could have known with such certainty. It was a detail that had been deliberately withheld from the public record, a small but crucial piece of evidence known only to the investigators and the person who had hidden the backpack. Victoria Thompson paused, letting the weight of the moment settle over the courtroom. She looked at Malik, who was now leaning back in his chair with a self-satisfied smirk, clearly proud of his clever correction. She then turned back to the jury, her expression a mixture of pity and disgust. She didn't need to say a word. Malik's own arrogance had just become her most powerful piece of evidence. He had inadvertently confessed, not with words of remorse, but with a boastful correction born of his desperate need to be seen as the smartest person in the room. The outburst shattered the fragile composure of the Green family. Christopher's father let out a choked sob, burying his face in his hands, while Grace Green stared at Malik with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. This was not a remorseful child. This was a monster who was relishing his moment in the spotlight, a performer who was enjoying the pain he was inflicting on them. The mask of the misunderstood teenager had not just slipped, it had been torn off and stomped on by the defendant himself. For Matthew Harris, it was a moment of profound professional despair. He had spent months trying to build a narrative of a confused kid, and in 5 seconds, his client had demolished it with a single, arrogant sentence. He could only sit there, his head bowed, as the judge instructed the jury to disregard the defendant's outburst, an instruction he knew they would be psychologically incapable of following. The trial had barely begun, and his client had already, for all intents and purposes, convicted himself with his own words. Malik, however, seemed oblivious to the damage he had caused, or perhaps he simply did not care. He seemed energized by the outburst, by the attention it had garnered. He saw it not as a mistake, but as a victory, a moment where he had asserted his superior knowledge and taken control of the narrative. He was no longer a defendant in a murder trial. He was the narrator, the expert, the one who held the truth. The rest of the day's proceedings unfolded under the shadow of that moment. Witnesses came and went, but the jury's eyes kept drifting back to the defendant, to the 15-year-old boy who had just shown them the cold, proud heart of a killer. Victoria Thompson adjusted her strategy on the fly, realizing she no longer needed to convince the jury that Malik was guilty of the act. She now needed to convince them of the depth of his depravity, to show them that this was not just a murder, but an act of profound and unrepentant evil. As the court adjourned for the day, Malik Robinson was led away, a faint smirk still playing on his lips. He had made his mark, he had seized the stage, and in his own twisted mind, he had won the day. But in the silent, horrified eyes of everyone else in that courtroom, he had done something far different. He had stripped away any lingering doubt and revealed the monster beneath the suit, setting the stage for a trial that would now be a grim and necessary formality on the path to his inevitable conviction. The second week of the trial marked a significant shift in the prosecution's strategy, moving from establishing the basic facts of the crime to delving into the psychological horror of the defendant's mindset. Victoria Thompson knew that Malik Robinson's courtroom outburst had already sealed his fate in the minds of many, but she was determined to leave no room for doubt and to ensure the jury understood the full scope of his cruelty. She planned to introduce the centerpiece of her case, the undeniable evidence that would silence any potential argument from the defense, the video Malik had recorded of the murder itself. However, she chose to build toward this moment, layering the evidence to create a crescendo of horror. The mid-trial twist did not come from a single piece of evidence, but from a powerful and unexpected source. The prosecution called a surprise witness, a shy, soft-spoken girl named Riley Moore, who had been a peripheral friend of Christopher's. She took the stand with trembling hands, her voice barely a whisper as she was sworn in. No one on the defense team, and certainly not Malik, had anticipated her testimony. She had come forward to Detective Clark only days before the trial, tormented by a secret she could no longer keep. Riley explained that on the afternoon of the murder she had been in the same park, walking her dog along a less traveled path. She had seen Malik and Christopher talking near the old oak tree, and feeling a strange sense of unease from Malik's aggressive posture, had decided to discreetly film them on her phone from a distance, hidden behind a thicket of bushes. She told herself it was just in case something happened, a small act of caution in a world that often felt unsafe. She had not witnessed the murder itself. She had become frightened and left before the situation escalated to physical violence. But what she had captured was crucial. Her video, shaky and partially obscured by leaves, showed the initial confrontation. It captured Malik's menacing tone, his verbal bullying, and his relentless psychological torment of Christopher. Most importantly, it captured Christopher's voice, clear and heartbreaking, as he repeatedly tried to de-escalate the situation, his words filled with a gentle reason that was no match for Malik's irrational rage. "I don't want any trouble, Malik," Christopher could be heard saying, his voice pleading. "Let's just talk about this. We can work it out." The video from Riley Moore's phone was played for the courtroom. A heavy silence fell as the jury watched the two boys on the screen, one a figure of quiet dignity and the other a predator circling his prey. The audio was the most damning part. It captured Malik's cold, cruel voice, lecturing Christopher, mocking his kindness, and telling him that his weakness was a disease that needed to be cured. It was a live recording of the twisted ideology that Malik had written about in his journals, spoken aloud in the moments leading up to the murder. The footage was a gut punch to the entire courtroom. It allowed the victim to speak from beyond the grave, his own words serving as a testament to his gentle character. It provided a context for the violence that followed, showing that this was not a sudden fight, but a calculated act of persecution. For the Green family, hearing their son's voice again was both a comfort and an agony, a beautiful and painful reminder of the kind soul who had been stolen from them. Malik Robinson watched the video with a look of intense fury. He was not angry at the content. He was enraged that someone else had a recording, that another director had captured a piece of his production. He glared at Riley Moore as she sat on the witness stand, a look of pure hatred in his eyes. He saw her not as a witness to his crime, but as a rival, someone who had stolen a piece of his story, his glory. Victoria Thompson then used Riley's video as a foundation to introduce the main event, the video from Malik's own hard drive. She argued to the judge that Riley's video established a baseline of the defendant's malicious intent and that Malik's own video was the necessary and horrific conclusion to that narrative. The judge, having seen the footage in his chambers, agreed, and after a stern warning to the gallery about the graphic nature of the evidence, the prosecutor dimmed the lights in the courtroom. The video that played next was a journey into the heart of darkness. Filmed from Malik's perspective, it was a first-person view of a murder. The jury saw what he saw, heard what he heard. They heard Christopher's pleas turn to cries of pain, and they heard Malik's calm, steady breathing as he inflicted the fatal injuries. The video was a document of pure, unadulterated evil, made all the more horrifying by the killer's decision to preserve it as a trophy. Several jurors gasped, and one broke down in quiet, convulsive sobs. A bailiff had to help a distraught member of the gallery out of the courtroom. The footage was relentless, a raw and unfiltered look at the final moments of a young man's life. Throughout the playing of the video, Malik watched the screen with a rapt, almost reverent attention. He was not watching a recording of a crime, he was admiring his own work, a faint smile of satisfaction on his lips. When the video ended and the lights came back up, the courtroom was left in a state of stunned, horrified silence. The air was thick with a shared trauma. Victoria Thompson stood before the jury, her face a mask of grim resolve, and allowed the silence to stretch, to let the horror of what they had just witnessed sink in. The images were seared into their minds, a permanent and irrefutable testament to the defendant's depravity. This one-two punch of video evidence was the turning point of the trial. Riley Moore's video provided the context, the psychological prelude to the crime, showing the defendant's calculated cruelty. Malik's own video provided the gruesome climax, a direct and undeniable view of the act itself. Together they formed a narrative so powerful and so damning that any defense seemed not just futile, but obscene. The prosecution's case was now built on a foundation of digital truth, a modern form of evidence that was more powerful than any eyewitness testimony. The smart devices that these teenagers carried with them everywhere had become silent witnesses, one capturing the prelude to a murder out of a sense of fear, the other capturing the act itself out of a sense of sadistic pride. The trial was no longer a question of who did it, or even why they did it. It was now a solemn and necessary process of holding a monster accountable for an act of evil that he himself had meticulously and proudly documented for the world to see. For Matthew Harris, the defense attorney, it was the end of the line. There was nothing he could say, no argument he could make that could possibly counter the visual and auditory evidence the jury had just absorbed. His client was no longer just a defendant, he was the star of his own snuff film. As he looked at the faces of the jurors, he saw no flicker of doubt, no hint of sympathy, only a shared look of profound and settled horror. The prosecution had rested its case not with a statement, but with a silent, screaming video that would echo in the minds of everyone who saw it for the rest of their lives. The defense's case began under a cloud of grim inevitability. After the prosecution's devastating presentation of the video evidence, Matthew Harris knew he had no viable path to an acquittal. His only hope was to humanize his client in some small way, to salvage some fragment of a narrative that could persuade the jury to consider a sentence less severe than life without parole. His strategy, born of desperation, was to put Malik Robinson on the stand, a decision that went against every instinct he had as a defense attorney, but one that his client had unequivocally demanded. Malik took the stand with the confidence of a king ascending his throne. He seemed to relish the moment, the entire courtroom's attention focused solely on him. He adjusted the microphone, took a sip of water, and looked directly at the jury, a faint, condescending smile on his face. He was not there to defend himself against a murder charge. He was there to deliver a lecture, to explain his superior worldview to the simple-minded people who were about to judge him. Under the gentle, guiding questions of his own attorney, Malik began to spin his narrative. He painted himself as a misunderstood visionary, a young man who saw the world with a clarity that others lacked. He described Christopher Green not as a victim, but as a symbol of societal decay, a representation of the weakness and mediocrity he felt compelled to oppose. He spoke in grand, abstract terms, using words like order, strength, and consequence, attempting to frame the murder as a philosophical act rather than a brutal crime. Matthew Harris tried to steer him toward expressing some form of remorse, but Malik skillfully evaded every attempt. When asked if he regretted what happened, Malik paused for a long moment, a look of deep contemplation on his face. "I regret the sloppiness," he finally said, his voice firm. "I regret that I was not more careful in my planning. But do I regret the act itself? No, the act was necessary. It was a stunning admission, a complete repudiation of the very concept of remorse." The true implosion of the defense's case, however, came during the cross-examination. Victoria Thompson approached the witness stand not with aggression, but with a calm, surgical precision. She knew that Malik's arrogance was his Achilles heel, and she intended to use it to dismantle him, piece by piece. She began not by questioning his actions, but by questioning his intelligence, the very core of his narcissistic self-image. She brought up his school transcripts, pointing out his mediocre grades in subjects like history and literature. She quoted passages from his own journal, highlighting grammatical errors and simplistic, contradictory philosophical statements. With each question, she chipped away at the facade of the intellectual giant, revealing the insecure, angry teenager underneath. Malik's calm demeanor began to crack, his confident smile replaced by a tight, irritated frown. He began to argue with her, to correct her pronunciation, to tell her she was misinterpreting his complex ideas. The turning point came when Thompson brought up the video he had filmed. "You fancy yourself a filmmaker, don't you, Mr. Robinson?" she asked, her voice dripping with irony. "A documentarian of your own greatness." Malik bristled at the question, falling directly into her trap. "I am an artist," he declared, his voice rising. "What I created was a piece of art, a document of a necessary act. You wouldn't understand. Your mind is too conventional." Victoria Thompson then played a small, silent clip from the video on the courtroom monitors, the moment where Christopher is pleading for his life. She froze the frame on Christopher's terrified face. "Is this art, Mr. Robinson?" she asked, her voice low and powerful. "Is this boy's terror the medium for your masterpiece? Is his life the price of your self-expression?" The courtroom was utterly silent. Malik stared at the frozen image on the screen, his jaw working, for the first time seeming to be at a loss for words. He was confronted with the raw human reality of his crime, stripped of all his philosophical justifications. He saw not a symbol, but a terrified boy, and for a fleeting second a flicker of something, panic perhaps, or even a microscopic sliver of guilt crossed his face. But the moment passed, and his narcissistic defenses slammed back into place. He lashed out, his voice filled with rage. "You're twisting my words. You're trying to make me look like a monster," he shouted, pointing a finger at the prosecutor. "He was nothing. He was an insect. I did the world a favor by stepping on him." It was the confession the prosecution had been waiting for, a raw, unfiltered explosion of his true self. The performance was over, the mask was gone, and all that was left was the hideous, unvarnished rage of a predator. He had lost control, and in doing so, he had destroyed the last infinitesimal chance he had of swaying the jury. His own testimony had become the final and most damning piece of evidence against him. The cross-examination continued, but it was merely a formality. Malik was a different person on the stand now. His intellectual posturing was gone, replaced by a sullen, petulant anger. He answered questions with one-word responses, his arms crossed defensively over his chest. He had been exposed, his intellectual superiority revealed as a fragile sham, and he could not handle the narcissistic injury. Matthew Harris sat at the defense table, his face ashen. He had known putting Malik on the stand was a risk, but he had not anticipated a self-immolation of this magnitude. His client had not just failed to express remorse, he had doubled down on his lack of it, screaming his contempt for the victim to the entire world. The defense's narrative had not just been undermined, it had been vaporized in a spectacular explosion of the defendant's own ego. When Malik finally stepped down from the witness stand, he avoided looking at anyone. He stared at the floor as he walked back to the defense table, his earlier swagger completely gone. He had entered the courtroom believing he was the star of the show, the master of the narrative. He left the stand as what he truly was, a pathetic, angry child who had committed a monstrous act and had just boasted about it to the 12 people who held his life in their hands. The defense had rested its case, but in reality, the case had been over from the moment the defendant opened his mouth. The final phase of the trial, before the closing arguments and jury deliberation, was the presentation of victim impact statements. This was the moment for the court to hear not about the crime or the perpetrator, but about the person who was lost, to measure the void that had been left in the world by his absence. It was a solemn and often heartbreaking ritual of the justice system, a formal acknowledgement of the human cost of a crime. For the trial of Malik Robinson, it became the emotional breaking point, a moment that crystallized the profound difference between the humanity of the victim's family and the soullessness of the defendant. Grace Green was the first to speak. She walked to the podium with a quiet, fragile dignity, clutching a small framed photograph of her son, Christopher. She did not look at the judge or the jury, but directly at Malik Robinson, her eyes filled with a pain so immense it seemed to have a physical weight. Her voice, when she began to speak, was soft but unshakable, a testament to a mother's strength in the face of unimaginable loss. She spoke of Christopher not as a saint, but as a real and wonderful boy. She shared small, intimate memories, the way he would hum off-key when he was concentrating on his homework, his secret love for terrible puns, the time he had spent an entire month's allowance to buy a special gift for his father's birthday. Her words painted a vivid portrait of a life filled with small kindnesses, quiet laughter, and a deep and abiding love for his family. The courtroom was silent, captivated by the raw, unvarnished grief in her voice. "Every day," she said, her voice cracking for the first time, "I wake up and for a single, blissful second, I forget. And then I remember, and the horror of it crashes down on me all over again. You did not just take my son's life. You took my ability to feel joy. You took the future. You took everything." It was during this moment, this crescendo of a mother's agony, that several people in the jury box noticed the defendant. While Grace Green poured out her heart, her body trembling with the effort of holding herself together, Malik Robinson was seen to let out a long, slow, deliberate yawn. He did not bother to cover his mouth. He then stretched his arms behind his head, rolled his eyes with theatrical boredom, and turned his head to look at the clock on the courtroom wall, as if counting the seconds until this tiresome display was over. The act was so blatant, so profoundly disrespectful, that it was like a physical blow. A wave of outrage rippled through the gallery. Christopher's father, who had been sitting with his head in his hands, looked up and saw Malik's display of contempt. He let out a strangled cry of rage and grief and had to be restrained by his brother as he started to rise from his seat. The judge banged his gavel, his own face a mask of cold fury, and ordered the bailiffs to restore order. But the image was seared into the mind of everyone present, especially the jury. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated evil, a demonstration of a soul so empty that it could not even feign respect in the face of a mother's unbearable pain. Malik's yawn was more damning than any piece of evidence, more incriminating than any testimony. It was a confession of his own inhumanity, a silent, contemptuous scream that he felt nothing, no remorse, no pity, no shame. The subsequent victim impact statements only served to reinforce this chilling contrast. Christopher's best friend spoke, his voice thick with tears, about how Christopher had stood up for him against bullies in middle school. His favorite teacher described his intellectual curiosity and the kindness he showed to struggling classmates. Each story added another brushstroke to the portrait of a good and decent young man, making the senselessness of his death all the more profound. And through it all, Malik remained a statue of bored indifference. He did not react, he did not flinch, he did not show a single flicker of human emotion. He was a black hole of empathy, absorbing the raw pain and grief being directed at him and reflecting nothing back. His detachment was terrifying, a psychological wall so thick that no amount of human suffering could penetrate it. The breaking point for the jury came when the final statement was read. It was a letter from Christopher's younger sister, who was too traumatized to appear in court. In the simple, unadorned language of a child, she wrote about how her big brother used to read to her every night and how he had promised to teach her how to ride a bike without training wheels this summer. "Now my room is quiet," the prosecutor read, her own voice choked with emotion, "and I don't think I want to learn how to ride a bike anymore." As these heartbreaking words filled the courtroom, a single juror, a middle-aged woman with children of her own, could no longer contain her emotions. She began to weep openly, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Her tears seemed to break a dam of suppressed emotion throughout the courtroom. Other jurors were seen wiping their eyes, and even the stoic court reporter had to pause for a moment to compose herself. The entire room was united in a shared moment of profound grief and empathy, with one glaring exception. Malik Robinson watched the juror cry with a look of clinical curiosity, a faint analytical smirk on his face. He seemed to be studying her, as if she were a strange insect under a microscope. He was not a participant in this human moment. He was an alien observer, incapable of understanding, let alone sharing, the emotions that were washing over everyone else. The judge, seeing the state of his jury and the raw emotion in the room, called for a brief recess. As Malik was led out of the courtroom, he passed by his own parents. His mother reached out a hand to touch his arm, her face pleading, but he pulled away from her, his expression one of annoyance and disgust. He had severed every human connection, not just to his victim, but to his own family, to the entire human race. That yawn, that glance at the clock, that cold observation of a juror's tears, these were the moments that truly convicted Malik Robinson. The evidence had proven he was a killer, but his own behavior in the face of the Green family's grief had proven he was a monster. The trial had reached its emotional climax, a breaking point from which there was no return. The jury had not just heard about the crime, they had been given a direct and unforgettable look into the empty, desolate soul of the person who had committed it. The closing arguments were a study in contrasts. Victoria Thompson, for the prosecution, delivered a powerful and methodical summary of the state's case. She walked the jury through the evidence one final time, from Malik's arrogant confession to the horrifying video, culminating in his soulless performance during the victim impact statements. Her argument was simple and devastating. The evidence did not just prove guilt, it proved a level of calculated cruelty and remorselessness that was almost beyond human comprehension. She asked not for vengeance, but for justice, for a verdict that would acknowledge the profound evil of the defendant's actions and protect society from him forever. Matthew Harris, in his closing, was faced with an impossible task. He could not argue innocence, the evidence was too overwhelming. Instead, he made a plea for mercy, framing Malik as a product of a society that had failed him, a mentally ill child whose delusions had led to a terrible tragedy. He urged the jury to look beyond the monster they thought they saw and find the lost boy underneath. It was a valiant effort, a lawyer fulfilling his duty to the very end, but his words felt hollow, a faint whisper against the howling wind of the evidence they had all seen and heard. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. The speed of their verdict was a testament to the undeniable clarity of the case. When they filed back into the jury box, their faces were grim and resolved. The foreman handed the verdict to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. The courtroom held its collective breath as the judge unfolded the paper and read the single fateful word, guilty. A wave of relief and sorrow washed over the Green family's side of the courtroom. There were quiet sobs, not of joy, but of a grim and final closure. Across the aisle, Malik's mother let out a strangled cry and collapsed into the arms of her husband. Malik himself, however, showed no reaction. He stared straight ahead, his expression unreadable, as if he were watching a movie about someone else's life. But the trial was not quite over. The prosecution had held back one final piece of the puzzle, a witness they had chosen to call only during the sentencing phase, which in this jurisdiction followed immediately after the verdict. Victoria Thompson called a surprise witness to the stand, a young man named Andrew Thomas, a former friend of Malik's from middle school who had moved away 2 years prior but had contacted the police after seeing news of the trial. Andrew's testimony provided the final horrifying twist, a revelation that recontextualized the entire crime. He told the court that he and Malik had been part of a small, secretive group of boys who had invented a twisted and elaborate game. The game had a complex set of rules and a point system, but its central objective was to exert power and control over others through acts of psychological and physical cruelty. They would target students they deemed weak or inferior, and they would earn points for acts of humiliation and intimidation. Andrew, his voice trembling with shame, explained that he had left the group and his family had moved away after he realized how dangerous Malik's obsession with the game was becoming. Malik was not just a player, he was the creator and the game master, the one who constantly pushed for more extreme and sadistic acts. The other boys were followers, drawn in by Malik's charismatic and forceful personality, but Malik was the engine of the group's cruelty. The final revelation was the bombshell that silenced the courtroom. Andrew testified that Malik had often spoken of a final level of the game, an ultimate act that would prove his absolute superiority and allow him to win forever. This final level involved taking a life, not out of anger or passion, but as a strategic move in the game. The victim had to be a pawn, someone whose removal would demonstrate the player's power and their complete detachment from conventional morality. Suddenly, the senseless murder of Christopher Green had a motive, and it was a motive more chilling than any simple hatred or rage. Christopher had not been killed because of who he was, but because of what he was, a perfect pawn in Malik Robinson's sick and twisted game. His kindness, his gentleness, his lack of enemies, these were the very qualities that had made him the ideal target. He was an unwilling player in a game he did not even know existed, and his murder was the final triumphant move by a player who saw life and death as nothing more than a way to keep score. This testimony was the key that unlocked the final door to Malik's psyche. It explained his detachment, his lack of remorse, and his obsession with his own intelligence and planning. He was not just a killer, he was a game master who had executed a flawless strategy. His confession had not been a confession, it had been a post-game analysis, a victor boasting of his tactics. His performance in court was not that of a defendant, but of a winner taking a victory lap, explaining his brilliant moves to an audience of lesser beings. Victoria Thompson asked Andrew one final question. Did this game have a name? Andrew looked down, his face pale. Yes, he whispered. Malik called it the God Game, because he said whoever won would become a god. The words hung in the air, a final, damning epitaph for Malik's humanity. He had not just committed a murder, he had committed a blasphemous act of self-deification, with Christopher Green as the human sacrifice on the altar of his own ego. The jury, who had already convicted him of the crime, now understood the full, terrifying depth of the motive behind it. They had been tasked with judging a boy, but they had found themselves staring into the face of someone who genuinely believed he was a god. As Andrew Thomas stepped down from the stand, Malik finally showed an emotion. It was not remorse or fear, it was a flicker of pure, unadulterated rage. He was furious that his secret had been revealed, that the sacred rules of his game had been exposed to the world by a former unworthy player. His masterpiece had been tainted by the understanding of the common masses. He glared at Andrew with the fury of a fallen deity, his carefully constructed world shattered by the testimony of a boy who had dared to walk away from his game. The final revelation was complete, and the stage was now set for the final act of judgment. The final day of the trial was a formality, but it was a necessary one. The guilty verdict was in, the horrifying motive had been revealed, and all that remained was for the judge to impose the sentence. The courtroom was once again filled to capacity, the atmosphere heavy with the anticipation of a final and binding judgment. Malik Robinson was led to the defense table for the last time, his face a mask of sullen, defiant anger. The revelation of his God game had stripped him of his intellectual superiority, leaving him exposed and furious. Before passing sentence, the judge, a veteran jurist named Arthur Coleman, offered the defendant an opportunity to speak. It was a standard procedure, a final chance for a person to express remorse or offer an explanation. Matthew Harris placed a hand on his client's shoulder, silently pleading with him to stay silent, to not make a terrible situation even worse. But Malik, ever the performer, could not resist one last moment on the stage. He stood up, pushed his lawyer's hand away, and faced the judge with a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. He did not apologize. He did not ask for mercy. Instead, he delivered a short, chilling speech, his voice dripping with a venomous rage. He condemned the flawed justice system, the intellectually inferior jury, and the sentimental, weak-willed prosecutor. He reaffirmed his belief in his own superiority and stated that his only regret was being judged by people who were not his peers. It was a final, desperate assertion of the narcissistic delusion that had driven him to murder, a last stand for the crumbling kingdom of his own mind. He then turned his gaze from the judge and looked directly at the Green family. "You should thank me," he said, his voice a low, menacing snarl. "I made him famous. Before me, he was a nobody. Now he'll be remembered forever, all because of me." The cruelty of the statement was breathtaking. It was his final act of psychological torture, a last twist of the knife in the open wound of their grief. Christopher's father lunged forward, screaming, and was held back by bailiffs. Grace Green simply closed her eyes, her face a portrait of unbearable pain, as if refusing to grant the monster the satisfaction of seeing her break. It was at this moment that Judge Coleman, a man known for his stoic and impartial demeanor, finally lost his judicial restraint. His face, which had been impassive throughout the trial, was now flushed with a deep and righteous fury. He banged his gavel with such force that the sound echoed like a gunshot through the silent courtroom. "That is enough, Mr. Robinson," the judge's voice boomed, no longer the dispassionate tone of a jurist, but the roar of a man pushed past his limit. "You have sat in this courtroom for weeks, a monument to your own arrogance and depravity. You have shown not a flicker of remorse, not a hint of humanity. You speak of games and gods, but you are nothing more than a pathetic and broken child who has committed an act of unspeakable evil." The judge stood up, a rare and powerful gesture, pointing a trembling finger at the defendant. "You are not a god, you are not a genius, you are a cancer on the soul of this community, and the law has a prescribed treatment for your particular disease. It is my solemn duty to excise you from our society, to ensure that you can never again inflict your twisted games on another innocent human being." His voice filled the room, each word laden with the weight of a just and terrible wrath. "You wanted to be remembered forever, Mr. Robinson. You will be. You will be remembered as a case study in evil, a cautionary tale whispered by parents to their children. But Christopher Green," the judge said, his voice softening as he turned his gaze to the Green family, "he will be remembered for his kindness, his gentle spirit, and the love he gave to his family and friends. His legacy is one of light, yours is one of darkness." Judge Coleman then delivered the sentence. He spoke of the need to protect society, the need for retribution for the crime, and the complete absence of any mitigating factors or hope for rehabilitation. For the murder of Christopher Green, he declared, his voice ringing with finality, "This court sentences you, Malik Robinson, to the maximum penalty allowed by law, life in prison without the possibility of parole." The words sealed Malik's fate, his arrogant facade finally, completely shattered. The color drained from his face, and his mouth fell open in a look of genuine, uncomprehending shock. In his own mind, he had been untouchable, his greatness a shield against such mundane consequences. The reality of a lifetime spent in a concrete cell, stripped of his power and his audience, crashed down on him with the force of a physical blow. As the bailiffs moved in to escort him from the courtroom for the final time, Malik Robinson, the self-proclaimed god, was reduced to what he had always been, a terrified 15-year-old boy. He began to struggle, to scream, to cry, not with tears of remorse for his victim, but with the pathetic, self-pitying sobs of a child who had finally been told no. "You can't do this to me," he shrieked, his voice cracking. "I am the one who makes the rules." His final, desperate cry was drowned out by the sound of the courtroom doors closing behind him, a sound of absolute finality. The judge remained standing for a long moment, looking out over the weeping, exhausted courtroom. He had not just delivered a sentence, he had delivered a final, powerful condemnation of a worldview that celebrated cruelty and devalued human life. He had reaffirmed the primacy of law over the delusions of a single, evil mind, and in doing so had offered a sliver of justice to a family and a community that had been shattered by an act of incomprehensible hatred. The God game was over, and the self-proclaimed deity had been cast out, his reign ending not with a bang, but with the pathetic whimper of a boy who had to face the consequences at last.